everyone, and thank you for joining Doing DevSecOps Right, Implementation and the Metrics That Matter. My name is Lisa Mokaba, and I'm the Communications Director here at Capsulate. I'm joined by Kelly Shortridge, our VP of Product Strategy, and guest analyst at Tradeoffs. They're going to be breaking down how to implement DevSecOps, as well as the KPIs and metrics you should be measuring to make sure your company is continually reducing risk. Before I turn it over to them, a few housekeeping items. One, if you have any questions, please do type them into the Q&A box provided, and we'll try to get to all of them at the conclusion of the webcast. And also, this webcast will be available on demand, so we'll send a link over once it's ready to go. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amy to kick us off.
Great, thank you. So welcome, everybody. The first thing we're going to talk about, we're going to dive right into why are we even doing DevOps in the first place, let alone DevSecOps. Well, what we find is that DevOps companies that implement DevOps actually make more revenue. So this is from data from our infrastructure survey. We do these big surveys. Some of the data that I'll be showing you is from our security survey, developer survey. This one is actually from our infrastructure survey. And what we asked them was, have you adopted DevOps and application release automation? And if you have, then what is your year-over-year revenue growth? And what we found was that those folks who have adopted DevOps and application release automation actually fell more into the 10% or more year-over-year revenue growth than not. And so if you are able to release applications with new features and functionality to customers faster, then you're more likely to win. You're more likely to win that extra revenue. And we've seen that for a long time. And in fact, this isn't, this is from our data, but also the state of DevOps has been saying this for a while too, saying, hey, you actually make more money, your stock does better if you are able to get to your customers with new and better features first. Okay, so once you've started adopting DevOps, then what does it look like? And we're going to spend a few minutes on this slide. I know there's a lot of data here, and we're going to walk through it. We're going to really focus on the column that says monthly. So these are the different practices that DevOps teams are implementing. And it's important for security folks to understand what their teams are doing so that we understand where we fit in, where we can add hooks, where we should step in, what our role is in the whole DevOps process. So you see that going from quarterly or less frequently, there's a lot of gray in that row. That is outdated practice. And then when you go to monthly, there's a shift to a whole lot of the dark green, which is the best practice. And a few of the lighter green, which is a good practice. If you go all the way out to daily or more frequently, you'll see some of the emerging practices, which is the extremely light green. But anyway, back to the quarterly, less frequently, switch to the monthly. Like I said, you've got this huge switch from outmoded practice into best practice. So in the technology section, what you've got teams doing is automating their build pipeline and delivery pipelines. So they're implementing a lot of different technologies to really make that whole process very smooth. The dream, of course, is to have a developer check in code, and if it passes all of its quality gates, to actually go out and be delivered to customers immediately. So you see a lot of things like the CI pipeline creation, automated testing, mass adoption of cloud, all in an effort to make getting applications out to customers smooth. Now in the people section, going from quarterly or less frequently to monthly, you've got this jump into a totally different organization for these DevOps teams. Developers and operations are forming integrated product teams where maybe you aren't actually reporting into the same manager, but you certainly have dotted lines. Now, the thing for security pros to remember is, and this ratio applies roughly, if there's 100 developers, there's 10 operations, and there's a single security person, and that security person may not be application security. So there's not very many security folks. So as the DevOps organization, the people change, moves to these integrated product teams, It's important for security folks to know that you're probably going to have to form a center of excellence. You'll probably have application security folks that are dedicated to multiple DevOps teams, and that's okay. You can be perfectly successful in that, but it is important that you do have ties into these DevOps teams. You know who is assigned to what team, and that person then understands what the teams are doing and what their goals are. As we move into governance, this really moves from the kind of strategic planning, very slow-moving governance to actually having governance inside the code, that the developers themselves are documenting what they are doing and what they are trying to achieve inside the code, but also moving to more of a portfolio review. For security pros, the interesting thing about this switch in governance actually usually affects us in budget, oddly enough, where security folks like to apply budget yearly. It usually comes out of a single security budget bucket. But as we make this jump in governance between this kind of annual strategic planning into portfolio reviews and the kind of these quick iterations of our planning, actually for budget, it may mean that we have to allocate budget by team or by developer. And it actually may mean that instead of yearly strategic planning for security actually may have to move to quarterly or faster strategic planning on our own part so we can plan budget accordingly to the changes that these teams need. The last thing in process, going from very rigid process to being more incremental and iterative. And the thing that security pros need to understand is that their processes need to be moved to iterative and very changeable. We need to be flexible in our own processes so that we can match what our developers are doing. Now, when we look at application speed, it is changing, and you might even have applications that release in each one of these three buckets across your organization. The first bucket is those folks, about a third of them, that are releasing half yearly or slower. So, back to the previous slide, those are the ones that are using kind of those outmoded processes and people governance. They are moving slowly. And that's okay. This may be legacy apps. They may be apps that don't have active development teams behind them. Or it may be that these applications are just these huge monolithic applications that your organization just haven't had the chance to go back and re-architect. The middle group of folks, 26% releasing about once per quarter. So still in those outmoded kind of practices, but getting closer. At this point, 35% are building daily or multiple times per week. So there's still some speed underneath there, even if you are releasing only quarterly. And then the last group of folks, about a third, are releasing monthly or faster and can build on check-in or multiple times per day. And for that, you really do need to move to those very automated, iterative processes that you are able to respond to customer need very quickly. Now, the thing that we in security have to remember is, what are developers measured on? How do we make developers successful? Because if we are able to make developers successful, they will adopt the security practices that we are recommending. And there are two measures that developers use that have to do with speed. The first one is release-related measures. So it's the first one in the box. That one is all about time to deploy. How fast are they able to release? The next one is, what is their individual productivity and velocity and rework? Now, remember, when we say, hey, you've got a security defect, that comes back oftentimes as rework if we are pushing it late in the software delivery lifecycle. If we find defects in production, of course, then it's major rework. It is coming back to development teams, and that will also affect their velocity. Now, DevSecOps is important because what we find in terms of how external attacks are carried out. And this is from our security survey. We find that 40% of firms, they reported having a breach as a result of an external attack. We also ask about internal, but 40% say they had an attack from external. And the way the attacks were carried out, the first two ways were first, web application issues, weaknesses like SQL injection and cross-site scripting, not going away. Unfortunately, those are still hanging out at number one. And number two is software vulnerabilities. So being able to get into applications because of a known vulnerability. Now, last year, these two were switched at roughly about the same percentages. And what this tells me is we aren't getting any better at application security. This is still our weakest link and still the way that attackers are able to get in. So that's why we need DevSecOps, where security implements their own practices inside of the DevOps framework. Now, a lot of people talk about DevSecOps, and what they really mean is we're going to put security testing in the software delivery lifecycle as early as possible, which is great and should be done. You see here, I've got different quality gates. Those are the little gold diamonds. I've got them as little Gandalf, thou shalt not pass. You put in hard quality gates. You use pre-release testing and stop developers at different parts, hopefully as early as possible, so that then they can do remediation either on weaknesses or on vulnerabilities. And as you see here, when we look across the different application security, different tooling, you see that there's massive adoption in a few areas. What you see here is the darker blue represents a bigger adoption, a bigger change in adoption for those different technologies. And the big ones are software composition analysis, bot management, container security, which actually has two industries that are adopting it heavily, and API security. So we're seeing massive jumps in technology adoption in those four areas in particular. For pre-release scanning, we are seeing this shift to the left. So this is from our security survey, and we are seeing it shift to the left. So the one in the upper left-hand corner is DAST, the one to the right is FAST, and then the one below is software composition analysis. All three tools used to test either proprietary or open source components. And you see the big jump is actually in FAST, in development, instead of the current implementing 28% is going to go in the next year to 41% in the development stage, which is great. Software composition analysis moving into the testing phase, not as early as it could possibly go, which is really even into design, but in the testing phase, it's going from 36 to 52%. So good news, things are moving to the left, which is fantastic. One thing I want to pause here is, as you're thinking about continuous integration and creating this pipeline, many of the DevOps tools themselves can be vulnerable, and that's something to remember. We are creating these very powerful tools. So for example, in the form of Jenkins, so late last year, there was a vulnerability that was discovered in Jenkins, and what attackers were using it for was Jenkins to deploy Monero to try to make money, to do crypto mining. We just found this about 2 weeks ago. Again, for those folks who had not updated their Jenkins, had not patched it yet, we saw another slew of Monero getting installed with Jenkins. So as you think about security, it's not just the application itself, but it's also the tools that we've created. Are they secure as well? But the one thing I wanted to talk about was, don't forget about runtime protection. Oftentimes we talk about DevSecOps and we fail to mention the fact that, hey, by the way, we also need to be protecting in runtime. That, in our exuberance to do the testing early in the software delivery lifecycle, we often forget that we actually need to be protecting the applications. We still need to be protecting the applications. And oftentimes with new deployment methods, microservices are often paired with containers. They need specialized protection. And once we implement those specialized protections, they can be great feedback into our pre-release testing. Why did it get out into production in the first place? What kind of modifications should we be doing to our testing so that in the future, those issues don't make it out into the production environment? So when you think about runtime protection, there are specialized, like I said, technologies for different deployment methods, containers, serverless, and then there's the tried and true. There's the WAF. There's also things like bot management to prevent automated attacks. All of these things need to be thought of ahead of time and move in a very iterative way with our dev teams. How are we modifying our protections to match what our development is doing and keep pace with what they're doing? And with that, I will hand it over to Kelly.
Thanks so much, Amy. So while Capsule 8 offers attack protection for Linux production environments, I'll actually be focusing on DevSecOps metrics generally. I personally think that metrics shouldn't be tied to a particular vendor, and I would also caution all of you that you should be wary of any metrics that are suspiciously self-serving on behalf of a vendor. So obviously with metrics, you are what you measure. Therefore, you need to be careful about what you measure. If you optimize for something like a very narrow goal, you'll achieve a narrow program. So this section, I'll be talking about how can you fit DevOps goals within your security program, because you want to be working with the business rather than against it. I've often seen, frankly, that there are rarely metrics in place in many security programs outside of individual security products, like the number of detections over the past year. But for others of you that already have metrics in place, this may potentially involve a little bit of rethinking about what is actually worth measuring in security as well. First, I want to cover a few foundational principles that apply, frankly, whether you're measuring for DevSecOps or anything else within your security program. First is measuring at a global level rather than a team level. Ultimately, it's about making sure that you're serving the goals and the needs of the organization rather than just the security team. There are tons of ways you can optimize for security, the security team specifically, but that may not actually be benefiting your organization and what they care about. The second thing is you want to measure outcomes rather than outputs. And that basically means that sheer work product is insufficient. It's not just about the amount and the volume of work that you're outputting. You need to make sure that you're actually achieving particular goals. So something like more hours spent, more tests performed, those things aren't as important as things like reducing malicious events, reducing the attack surface, things that the business cares about. If your tests are increasing, but it's not actually resulting in an outcome about which the business cares, why are you doing it? The last thing is you don't want to focus on static indicators or reaching a so-called maturity threshold. If you do that, you're going to stagnate, and DevOps, frankly, doesn't really do stagnation, so they'll probably be pretty unhappy with your program if you're focused on static indicators or trying to reach some notion of, a perfect, absolute view of security. Another thing is if you focus on components, you'll lose sight of the whole system. Eventually, it will end up crushing you. What matters for security is the security of the system. So as a practical example, if you have a bunch of different databases, if each individual database is encrypted at rest, all of the data on it is, but communications to and from the databases are unencrypted, you're probably going to be toast. Something will go wrong, and it's because you've looked at a component level rather than a system level. This same principle applies completely with metrics. If you get too micro into things, if you get way too granular with your metrics, it'll make you optimize for the wrong things and you'll miss the bigger picture. You'll miss the bigger issues that will end up hurting your organization. There's some interesting research. Amy referred to the State of DevOps report, which is absolutely fantastic. There's also a book called Accelerate. And both of those are driven by empirical survey data about what makes elite DevOps performers in different organizations. The first metric is deploy frequency, and that is generally on demand. That's what elite DevOps performers do. This measures release cadence. How long does it actually take to release a feature or a product? The next one is lead time, and this one is generally less than 1 hour. So this measures the time to design and then deliver a feature. MTTR stands for mean time to recovery. That's also less than 1 hour generally, and it measures how quickly service can be restored. Finally, there's mean time to failure, which you may have heard, but don't measure this. It turns out that elite DevOps performers don't actually look to failure as a metric. And this is because failure is inevitable, just like it's common wisdom now that you're probably going to be subject to a breach or some sort of security incident. It's the same thing on the DevOps side. You have to be able to embrace failure, and trying to minimize it and measuring that is going to be unrealistic and end up with you stifling any innovation that happens in the business because you're so worried about making sure that failure can't occur. Luckily, a lot of these can be translated into security equivalents, which is very useful. You can apply similar translation for any other metrics your engineering has in your own organization. So for deploy frequency, view this as the release frequency of changes or configuration management as it relates to security. Think about the release frequency of patches, firewall rules, access control rules, all the things that are predominantly done manually, some are doing automatically, but being able to measure how quickly you can deploy those and how frequently you're able to will actually be really valuable in informing your security program. The next one is lead time. You can think of this like the lead time to design and deliver security features. And features I'm using here very broadly. So think about things like threat models, security reviews, security tooling, authentication controls, all the things that require a little more custom development. Then finally, there's MTTR, but here instead of recovery, it's remediation, though I personally think recovery could work as well. This involves how quickly do you remediate an incident, and it looks at time to triage, time to investigate, time to remediate. And a key finding for MTTR that's super interesting is even when looking at DevOps, the ability to remediate incidents quickly, and this is specifically security incidents, the ability to remediate those quickly, engineering performance actually increases. So it's highly correlated with higher performing DevOps organizations when you're able to remediate issues quickly. So security isn't really at odds with engineering in either of these cases. Another important aspect to remember is that DevSecOps has to prioritize resilience, not this notion of security maturity. As I discussed before, security maturity has this kind of holy grail in mind of an absolute notion of when you've reached this level of secure that's pretty unrealistic. Resilience, however, is a continuous process. So even on the SecDevOps world, I would argue there's no such thing as maturity anyway. It's a continuous journey, it's not a destination, and your metrics need to reflect that. It's not about robustness either, which would be the ability to block incidents or smash bugs early. You have to consider resilience, which is the ability to elegantly respond to incidents in a way that keeps your business humming along. Again, it's always about the business and its goals. Your metrics also have to include notions of adaptability and transformability, which are core components of resilience. So you can't just look at these static notions of what it means to be secure. Part of this is measuring trade-offs, and being able to measure trade-offs helps you counter the bias towards focusing on pure security or this notion of security maturity, because you're forced to take other business priorities into account as well. So for instance, you want to be able to measure overall impact. So do you get improved security, but are you also creating more friction for the rest of the organization? So a positive metric trend would be a reduction in the number of security fixes per release. However, if you're also seeing an increase in employee time spent using security tools, for example, engineers using application security tools, then you may need to rethink your program because you're causing pain elsewhere. You're essentially outsourcing the pain that your security team was experiencing before. The other thing is all metrics have to be compared in general with their impact on productivity, and that's both within the security team as well as outside of the security team. So there are a few measures that are common in DevOps of how good your culture is, and generally that's towards a mission-oriented culture. But one thing they break down is, for instance, how much of your team's time is spent on product maintenance versus problem solving. Do you have a ton of meetings? Is there a lot of firefighting? Or are you actually thinking strategically and problem solving, which is going to help your organization far more? Another way to look at impact is there increase in support tickets? So for example, if you introduce some sort of complicated, fancy authentication mechanism, are users elsewhere in the organization confused and filing a lot of support tickets to try to figure out what's actually going on? And finally, you always have to consider complexity as well. I call it a buzzkill, but you can think of it as always at odds with security, and almost everything increases complexity when you add something to it. So whether you're adding new tools, if you're adding vendors, if you're adding even just new products in your organization, you have to be keeping in mind complexity. So if you aren't measuring metrics around complexity, then you'll be missing some of your biggest security risk as well. One is you want to measure the levels of interconnectivity, centrality, and correlation of IT systems. Again, it's about systemic risk, not component risk. Going back to the example, are you just looking at individual databases rather than how they communicate with other systems around them? Is there one database on which every single API in your company relies? that would be a ton of systemic risk. So even if the individual component seems secure, you need to also be calculating metrics around that systemic risk as well. The other thing is you have to measure both short-term and long-term stress. If you have long-term stressors, as they're called, in place, they will erode your resilience over time, which means you won't be able to elegantly adapt to and recover from incidents as well. There are a ton of these in InfoSec, so think about employee turnover, the number of product types or systems you have in place, the number of security tools being used, even budget cuts. All of these things over time reduce your ability to actually respond to short-term stress. And short-term stress can involve active incidents, last-minute security reviews, which everyone hates, audits, new vulnerabilities. Being able to measure how well you respond to the short-term stressors can be a great proxy for resilience, while also indicating how prepared your DevSecOps program is prepared. Basically, how much your proactive efforts are paying off over time. So you have to be balancing both this long-term and short-term view in order to get a true picture of how resilient you are. With that, we thank you very much, and we will open it up for questions.
Great, thank you both so much. So we do have a couple questions that did come in throughout the course of the webcast. One, Amy, we had a question, someone looking to see, you had mentioned a ballpark ratio of 1 to 100 security people to technology people. And this person was wondering if they heard it correctly. They mostly hear companies use 1 to 100 of security people to total headcount.
Yeah. So yes, you did hear me correctly. The ratio holds, roughly speaking, that it's 100 developers, 10 operations per people, and then a single security person. And then that single security person could be network security, or could be data security, or application security. So they don't necessarily have to be application security. So that puts the application security people at a disadvantage because there's just so many more developers, which means that as developers and operations people create integrated product teams, those teams that are concerned with the success of a single product or service, security people will not be able to dedicate a single person to each one of those teams. There's just not enough application security people to go around. And so they will undoubtedly have to create a center of excellence so that those teams, have someone to go to. However, it is important that those people be assigned to a team. They are responsible to a particular, usually a handful or even, more teams, so that they understand exactly what those DevOps teams need and want.
Great. And what emerging development practices might pose the greatest challenge for security teams?
So security, unfortunately, is usually the last to know. In fact, I was on the phone with a CISO not long ago, and he swore up and down that he said that, an hour before, he would have sworn up and down that they did not have serverless functions in production. That was crazy. And right before our call, he had discovered that indeed they had serverless functions in production. And so he said, what I'm going to be doing after this call is figuring out how to protect this thing. So security is often put in an unenviable position of, I've got to protect this thing in production and then work my way backwards because they aren't kept up to date on what developers are doing. So I think probably the most emerging development practices are the ones we don't know about. And I think in terms of both serverless and containers, it's a switch to a from normal practices to do something differently. And that can be uncomfortable and it can require new technologies. And so we are left scrambling a lot more than with some of the other development practices.
I'd also argue that there are a few new technologies that, one, I think can actually help security. And if you aren't aware of them, I think it will be a tough time for you in the future. So for example, like service mesh, a lot of developers are now using that as a way to encrypt communications between components, again, to make the system itself more secure. They may be going around you because they know that they're checking the box on encryption that they need to meet compliance. And so you may not be aware of it. But the flip side to that, what I would say is the same way with orchestration tools that one thing I would argue that security people are missing is all the opportunity from these tools as well. So orchestration can also help you, for example, like deploy configuration management changes more quickly. It can help you automate a lot of the really manual tasks you have to do. Again, service mesh can mean that you don't have to worry so much about different certificate management and stuff like that. It's all done automatically for you. So while you should always try to be in the loop about new developer practices coming down the line, it's also thinking about, okay, how can the security team innovate with these tools as well? Because not only will the team benefit productivity wise, but then you'll more deeply understand these new workflows that are emerging for developers.
Great. And a good follow-up question to that, Kelly, are there any good lists of security metrics and measurements that you would recommend?
Most of the, to be perfectly honest, most of the metrics I've seen are generally driven by vendors. And again, they're very vendor biased. There'll be timescales for, how much is your detection proving, whatever else. Some of the metrics I've included here, again, I think if you anchor it around that deploy frequency, lead time, and MTTR, that's really the foundational. Think of that as, like security hygiene. This is the metrics hygiene. If you start with those, you're going to be in pretty good shape. Other metrics I've seen, which are a little different, would include the Net Promoter Score, which is often used for products. Actually, it's the thing where on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend a product to a friend. Similarly, you can do that for your organization, because a lot of DevOps is about gaining the right buy-in. It's about making sure that they do want to communicate with you. So something like NPS can actually help you figure out, like, how much is the rest of the organization willing to work with us? Does the organization feel like we're enabling them or hindering them? So survey results like that can be really useful from a kind of hybrid process and culture perspective as well.
And Amy, I know you touched on this a little bit, but if you could just go over, why doesn't the current definition of DevSecOps have runtime already in it?
Yeah, and Kelly touched on this too about metrics being driven by vendors, and the security testing vendors got in early on DevSecOps and really morphed the definition to their purposes, so that it really does refer mostly to how do we put this pre-release testing inside the software delivery lifecycle, especially as it's being automated. How do we create those quality gates? How do we get it early in the hands of developers, as early as possible? And so that really has taken on a life of its own, that DevSecOps is somehow tied to the pre-release security testing. The problem is that that's only one part of it. And that the other part of it truly is, how are we actually protecting our applications? Oftentimes, organizations only protect a handful of applications, the ones they consider most sensitive or most critical. The problem is, we've been seeing, even Equifax itself, that breach came in through what they would have qualified a non-critical, a non-sensitive application. And then it was able to, the attackers were able to then hop to different applications and different data sets. So we really need to think about how are we protecting all of our applications in production, not just a limited few.
Great. And just before we kind of end things, is there anything that either of you would like to add in that we didn't discuss, or that you wanted to get into a little bit further?
I would add that always reach out to your colleagues across the table in engineering and DevOps, because frankly, you can help brainstorm together. DevOps doesn't necessarily have all the answers, though I will say that they have a head start. So if you feel like, or if you can give DevOps a sense that, hey, this is actually a partnership, that you're in their court of wanting to make sure that, the products that are being released are of high quality, whether those are internal or externally facing, then you can start to make a lot of progress. And again, aligning your security metrics with the overall objectives of the business means that you, whether you're a CISO or if you're a SecOps engineer, you're going to be, frankly, much better received than the gatekeepers and no-sayers and all of the other stereotypes about security that exist today.
And I would just echo that sentiment. You know, DevSecOps is primarily a cultural shift. People rush to deploy technology, but it's those connections to the developers so that we aren't the last to know. It's the remembering that developers are measured on speed. So how do we implement speed? How do we even make developers go faster than they were able to before? And if we're able to do that, join the success with ours, then the whole company wins.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. This concludes today's webcast, and we hope that everyone found it valuable. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@capsulate.com, and we'll get back to you right away. And again, this webcast will be available on demand, so we'll be sending out a link to the full recording for everyone shortly. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.